Hello, everyone. You're listening to Uncomfortable Truths with Euclid Phoenix, where I talk about politics, religion, and other BS that I find interesting. Today, for religion, we will take a look at how science and Genesis talk past each other and how they don't have to. Few passages in Scripture have generated as much modern attention as Genesis 1. For many readers, Genesis appears to make claims about the natural world that science also seeks to explain. When those explanations differ, conflict seems unavoidable. But much of this conflict arises not because Genesis and science directly contradict one another, but because they are often asked to answer the same questions neither was originally designed to share. This chapter explores why Genesis and science often talk past each other, and how a clear understanding of one's purpose reveals that they need not be adversaries. The modern question imposed on ancient texts. Science asks, how did this happen? What mechanisms produce this? What is the timeline? Genesis asks, why does this exist? Who is behind it? What does it mean? The tension arises when modern readers assume Genesis is attempting to answer scientific questions. The ancient audience would not have recognized those questions at all. Genesis was not written to compete with astrophysics and evolutionary biology. It was written to assert that the world is purposeful, ordered, and grounded in divine intention. Genesis describes mating, science describes the process. Science excels at describing physical mechanisms, observable patterns, measurable timelines. Genesis excels at describing purpose, order, value, responsibility. When Genesis says, "Let there be light," it is making a theological claim. Light precedes structure, and creation begins in illumination. Science describes photons and cosmic background radiation. These are not rival explanations. They are operating on different levels. Genesis is concerned with the why there is something rather than nothing. Science begins after something already exists. Why literal conflict feels inevitable. Conflict often emerges from a sincere desire to defend Scripture's authority. If Genesis is not read as a precise material account, some fear that its truth is compromised. But this assumes truth may be technical to be real. Scripture must speak in modern categories. Meaning is dependent on mechanism. Genesis uses poetic structure, repetition, and symbolic ordering. It communicates truth in the language of theology and worship, not laboratory observation. Reading it as a scientific document risks misreading both the Bible and science. The structure of Genesis 1 suggests a different purpose. Genesis 1 is highly symmetrical. This structure suggests theological architecture, not chronological reportage. It is about forming realms and then filling them. The emphasis is on order, not sequence. Science does not operate in symmetrical literary patterns. Genesis does, where science and Genesis actually overlap. Despite talking past each other in many ways, Genesis and science share surprising harmony at key points. The universe has a beginning. Order emerges from formlessness. Life develops in stages. Humans are part of the natural world, yet distinct in consciousness. The world operates according to constant principles. Genesis does not describe these in scientific terms, but affirms the same underlying reality. The universe is intelligible and structured. That intelligibility is what makes science possible in the first place. The real conflict is philosophical, not scientific. The deepest disagreements is not about fossils or stars, it is about meaning. Science by method does not address purpose, value, moral responsibility. Genesis centers on those things. When science is taken to imply that meaning is accidental, it moves beyond science into philosophy. When Genesis is forced to describe physics, it is pulled behind its purpose into territory it never intended to occupy. The conflict is often between philosophical naturalism and theological purpose, not between Genesis and empirical observation. Two contemporary ways of knowing. A helpful way to see the relationship is this. Science explains the how of creation. Genesis explains the why of creation. These are not competing answers to the same question. They are answers to different questions about the same reality. You can understand how stars form while also believing they are declared good. You can accept evolutionary processes while affirming that humanity bears moral responsibility. Why Genesis still matters in the scientific age. Genesis 1 continues to matter because science cannot answer why existence is valuable, why order is meaningful, why humans should care for the world, why rest, dignity, and goodness matter. These are Genesis questions. Genesis does not lose relevance because science advances. It becomes clear that Genesis was never trying to be scientific in the first place. A shift in reading changes the relationship. When Genesis is read as theology instead of mechanics, vision instead of measurement, meaning instead of method, science stops feeling like a threat. Instead, it becomes a deeper exploration of the ordered world Genesis proclaims. The more science discovers order, the more Genesis' central claim that reality is structured and meaningful resonates. Conclusion. Listening to the earth on its own terms. Genesis and science often talk past each other because readers ask them to do the same job. They don't. Genesis tells us the world is intentional, ordered, good, and meaningful. Science tells us here is how the world behaves, forms, and changes. When each is allowed to speak its own voice, the conflict softens, not because questions disappear, but because categories become clearer. Genesis does not compete with science. It addresses what science cannot measure. And science, at its best, explores the very world Genesis calls us to see as a gift rather than an accident. Let's take a look at Genesis as contemplative literature, how to read Genesis 1 slowly and intentionally. Genesis 1 was not written to be skimmed. Its power emerges not through speed or argument, but through rhythm, repetition, and attentiveness. When approached contemplatively, Genesis 1 functions less like a report and more like a liturgical vision, a text designed to shape perception, not merely convey information. This chapter explores how Genesis 1 can be read as contemplative literature and offers practical guidance for readers slowly, intentionally, and transformatively. What it means to read contemplatively. I can't say this word today. A contemplative reading is not passive and not analytical in this usual sense. It is attentive rather than hurried, receptive rather than argumentative, formational rather than informational. Instead of asking, "What does this prove?" contemplative reading asks, "What is this text training me to see?" Genesis 1 rewards this kind of reading because it is deliberately patterned, rhythmic, and repetitive. Why Genesis 1 invites slowness. Genesis 1 is structured like a chant. And God said, and it was so. And God saw that it was good, and there was evening, and there was morning. These repetitions slow the reader down. They create liturgical time, not narrative urgency. When read quickly, these phrases feel redundant. When read slowly, they become anchors for reflection. The text does not rush creation, and neither should the reader. Reading by days, not chapters. A contemplative approach resists reading Genesis 1 all at once. Instead, read one day at a time. Sit with its movements. Notice what is named, separated, and blessed. Each day introduces a different aspect of order: light, space, land and growth, rhythm, life, conscious agency. Reading this way allows Genesis to function as a spiritual architect, not a data set. Paying attention to repetition and pattern. Genesis 1 is highly patterned, and contemplation attends to those patterns rather than skipping over them. Ask, why does God speak rather than act silently? Why is naming repeated? Why is goodness declared multiple times? Why does humanity receive a different kind of blessing? These are not filler phrases, they are theological cues. And contemplative reading, repetition is not redundancy, it is emphasis. Letting the text set the pace. Modern readers often impose their own urgency on Scripture. Genesis 1 resists that impulse. Try this practice. Read aloud. Pause after each major phrase. Let silence follow, and God saw that it was good. Silence is not absence here, it is completion. Genesis 1 assumes that reflection is part of reading. It does not fill every space with explanation because it expects the reader to inhabit the space between words. Light as contemplative theme. When reading contemplatively, symbols matter more than mechanisms. Light appears before anything else, not as an object, but as a condition of perception. Contemplative readers ask, what does it mean to see before forming? What does illumination precede? Light becomes awareness, clarity, orientation, meaning. Rather than debate in physics, contemplative reading allows light to function as spiritual insight. Separation as discernment. Genesis 1 repeatedly emphasizes separation, light from dark, waters from waters, land from sea. Contemplative reading treats separation not as division, but as discernment. Creation is ordered not by domination, but by distinction. This invites the reader to reflect. What needs clarity in my life? Where is confusion mistaken for unity? Where might proper boundaries restore peace? Genesis 1 teaches that wholeness is not sameness. Humanity is the pause in the text. The creation of humanity slows the text even further. God speaks in deliberative language. Humanity is addressed directly. Blessed becomes relational. Contemplative reading notices the shift. Less formula, more intention, more intimacy. The image of God is not rushed. It is introduced carefully, inviting reflection on dignity, responsibility, and relationship. And God saw that it was good, practicing sacred attention. This repeated declaration trains the reader to see creation as fundamentally affirmed. A contemplative practice might ask, what does it mean to look at the world and say good? How does this resist cynicism or exploitation? How does it shape the ethical attention? Genesis 1 does not deny suffering, but it insists that goodness precedes it, ending with rest, not explanation. Though the Sabbath technically appears in Genesis 2, contemplative reading anticipates it already. Creation does not climax in human achievement, it accumulates in rest. Reading Genesis contemplatively means stopping before overanalysis, allowing the text to settle, trusting that not everything must be resolved. The text ends not with instruction but with rhythm. A simple contemplative practice for Genesis 1. Step 1, read one day aloud. Step 2, sit in silence for a minute. Step 3, notice one phrase that lingers. Step 4, ask what it reveals about order, goodness, or responsibility. Step 5, end without forcing application. This is not study, it is attentive presence. Conclusion. Genesis 1 as a school of seeing. Genesis 1 read contemplatively becomes a school of perception. It teaches readers to see order rather than chaos, value distinction without division, recognize goodness before utility, understanding creation as gift rather than resource, embrace rest as sacred, not optional. The text does not ask to be mastered, it asks to be received. Genesis 1 is not only about how the world began, it is about how the world is meant to be seen, slowly, reverently, and with attention shaped by wonder rather than control. Part 2 of religion. How science and Genesis talk. Wait, I already did this. Okay. I guess that's it for now. I hope you have a nice day, and check out my links below, and I'll be back with other BS.